Let's turn now to our next team, which, as you can see, is the Carbons, coming from India. We've Aishwarya Shastry, Kuhu Gupta, and Nishtha Bhan, and they have put together a project called the Carbons, which is actually about funding for your SME. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. It's about fueling your body without fouling the earth. So we're going to take a look at a short video to explain to us more about that.
The Footprint Story. This is about 3 Indian women and their journey with food. Coming from a country of big taste and flavor, we learned to love food early.
With all of that diverse food, something
just remained the same. It was how food was being farmed, foddered, processed, packaged, and shipped. It was how this food was brought to market. And as we learned more about the reality of farm to fork, it was glaring. We were doing this all wrong. We were eating wrong. Food systems accounted for 34% of total greenhouse gas emissions globally. And in a world where we're fighting the clock and trying to beat our carbon budget, it matters a lot.
But it isn't easy finding greener options, so we wanted to help educate people on how they can fuel their body without fouling the earth.
Well, I think it's very clear there from that presentation what it is your project is working on. But let's hear your pitch in person. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I am Nish from the Carbons, and we are excited to be introducing our solution, Footprint, to you all today. We'll start off by understanding how we identified the problem that we needed to solve, and then jump into how we think Footprint can help. Finally, we'll talk about where we want to go with our application. To kick us off, let's move on to the next slide. What we identified as our unmet need was that there's an existence of fragmented and unusable data on the carbon footprint and nutritional value of food, resulting in uninformed food and diet choices by the general populace. Now, let's talk about how we got here in the next slide. It was a dinner with friends that sparked the interest in this area. We had talked at great length about how food packaging, transportation, retail are possibly areas that lead to most emissions, but it did not take very long for us to realize that in our researching process that this was just the tip of the iceberg. In the next slide, we can see that land use, livestock, could we move on to the next slide, please? We see that land use, livestock, and fish farms were the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to food processes. And the problem was really tied to how things were being farmed and what was farmed and foddered. Now, in the next slide, we see that it's obvious that not all foods have the same carbon cost. While animal-based foods were tied to about 61% of the emission, even within that category, beef had the highest carbon footprint. And we realized that a potential way to help this process, and we can see that in the next slide, would be to help consumers move towards a greener lifestyle without compromising their nutrition. And in the next slide, we see that that's where Footprint comes in. Our goal is to make eating green a convenience. And in the next few slides, we're going to talk more about that. From what we can see here on the right, there are 2 main components to our workflow. The first one is a user defining how sensitive they are to the nutritional scoring of the product as compared to the sustainability scoring. And we'll see more about that in just a second. But the second part is that the application reads through that grocery list, classifies products, and suggests replacements based on their specifications for that score. So with the next slide, let's move on to that. We'll understand the scores that we're leveraging. On the left, we have the Nutri-Score. The Nutri-Score is an overall grade assigned to a product based on its nutritional value, based on the ingredient list. So it helps us kind of judge if a food is good or bad when it comes to the health choices that we're making. And then on the right side, we have the Eco-Score. This assesses the life cycle of the food. So the entire impact of the production processes, agriculture, transportation, all of that good stuff. And our platform considers these 2 scores and the user-defined weightage to recommend replacements. Now, In the next slide, we can see that the databases that we're using and the data sets that we're using were primarily coming in from open food tracts. And the reason why we leveraged this was because this had a lot of material and a lot of products along with their eco scores and nutri scores already built into it. But besides leveraging this one data set, we also leveraged the Data Europa and Eurostat data sets as part of our research process. But let's go over to the next slide and understand how all of this really works. And to get into that, we're going to talk about how our algorithm is functioning. To kick it off with the first step, this is where the user will define their preferred score sensitivity. Are we okay with being suggested greener products if that means that the Nutri-score will be a little bit lower? And once those decisions are made in the beginning, we then move on to that second step. In this process, once a grocery list of whatever the customer bought in their first week has been scanned in, this will be fed into the app, translated into a digital list, and each product is then taken through a classification process. So if we have oat milk coming in, then the category would be milk, the type would be oat. And then the final step is where our score sensitivity now acts as that filter, which will tell you exactly what replacements we can suggest. And this is where the user would define if they're accepting it or not accepting it. They're not okay with that suggested move to the different product. Now let's see it in action in the next few slides. Here we have the login page. This is how a user will be setting up their profile inside of the system. And in the next slide, this is where we have the visibility into exactly what that visualization would look like. Once a receipt has been uploaded, you get visibility into the Nutri score, the weighted score. You can suggest to get a new product replacement, and you can see that trend on how you're progressing with the different updates you're making to your list. So with that, let's move on to the next one. And as we go through this application demo, we're going to see that entire workflow that a user will go through. They will initially go in and sign up inside of the system. They will go in and log into the tool just as they're normally used to doing on a web-based platform. And as soon as they're taken into the system, once they get that grocery list updated, this is where the system starts to work that algorithm through it. So we create that digital list, and we'll see that in just a bit. Can we move on to the next slide, please? In the interest of time, team, let's talk about the impact that our platform has. The first one is that we are a first of its kind lifestyle app in the market. We are flexible to the user's nutritional and sustainability goals. They get to decide how eco-score sensitive their replacement suggestions should be. We allow users to drive the pace of their own progression. By allowing them to take control, they're able to decide how big or small they need their first step to be towards a greener lifestyle. And they do not have to switch diets overnight. They can make smaller, easier decisions consistently. And the third point is that we make eating green a convenience. The consumer doesn't have to do the research. The app will tell them how they're doing today, what replacements they can make, and how that would improve their trends and how they would improve their carbon footprint. And finally, we don't see our app being just a user-based app. We do see that it can be leveraged by teams, by organizations. If a school is having its cafeteria produce being pulled in, they could leverage our app to assess exactly what their carbon footprint would look like. In the next slide, we can see what it takes to be a carbon footprinter. So you have to be environmentally conscious, a health conscious, intentional buyer. We do assume that this is something we would start off with the urban market primarily. And the reason we're going with that approach is because we want to make sure that they are around supermarket chains that we hope to partner with. And we'll talk more about that. Our go-to-market would be primarily starting with France. And the reason being that we see eco-score being adopted primarily there. We have seen grocery stores already adopting eco-score labeling inside of in France as well. And with that, let's go over to the final slide and talk about next steps. The first one is moving towards market readiness for our application. Due to limitations in the data available, we were able to present more of a MVP version. We would like to further refine our app, our algorithm, and our UX to be more robust. The second is partnership with supermarket chains. We think that the biggest benefit of this app will be when we can link our database to the product that our consumers' neighborhood markets have. That way, they're truly creating that next week's grocery list through our tool. And finally, to further streamline that process, it could also open the doors for us to integrate with grocery delivery apps or other lifestyle apps. With that, we think that the potential of foodprint truly goes beyond individuals. So, working towards models that support teams and organizations would be our next step. That takes us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you very much, Nish, for that presentation. Let me first ask you, you mentioned France as your go-to market and you explained why. Are there any other countries in Europe that you looked at to consider as possible?
That's a great question. And I think our natural progression would be mainly in the Western European countries. France would be the first one, but I think we don't see any reason to just stick to France in the future.
Well, as many of these big supermarkets operate internationally, so I suppose that gives you an help. What's different compared to existing apps in the same market with your app?
So we researched on the topic, and we have noticed that most of the apps are not very granular. They just ask you about your diet choices, if you're a vegetarian or if you eat meat, and they provide you with an average carbon emission value which you produce per year. But with our app, we aim to make it more granular based on the exact products which you buy over time and how your emissions change over time. So suppose if you're using a normal milk today and if you switch to a plant-based milk in the future, your scores would change.
Well, I have another question. Is the Nutri and Eco score always a balance as you presented in the app? Or are there many healthy foods that are also sustainable?
So we actually provide so in the app we actually give a weighted score, so a user could choose if the Nutri score is more important to them or if Eco score is more important to them. And of course there are healthy foods which are more sustainable, and it could also be the case that when you're looking into Nutri score, some of the items which have a higher Nutri score are not always very sustainable. So it really depends on the user, what's their preference.
And I have a great question here as well, asking, would it be possible to integrate the aim to reduce food waste into this system? Sometimes the question of wasting food is jumped over.
We currently we were not looking into that topic, but of course, in the future, we would like to make it as robust as possible and to include more features. So yeah.
Okay, and finally then, before I let you go, we have a question saying that buying local and supporting small producers are considered the building blocks of eating green. Is this always correct? Is it a misconception? And if so, how do you reconcile it with teaming up with big international supermarket chains?
I think buying local is great because you are going to be leveraging that pool which is right next to you. You cut down on transportation costs, you cut down on a lot of that end supply chain greenhouse gas emissions. But as we already talked about it, that's really not the biggest and most impactful part which needs to be cut down considering the limited time that we have. So, yes, it is great. It's a good step in the right direction, but it's not the answer to eating green or to making that lifestyle change eventually.
Well, thank you very much.